This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Today on the show, I have Jane McGonigal. We are here to discuss today what's imaginable. What can you imagine? Happens to be the title of her new book, Imaginable: How to See the Future Coming and Feel Ready for Anything, even things that seem impossible today. Now, you might think for a second a guy who comes from a trend-following perspective might have beefs with that title. Not necessarily. Jane is not attempting to say that she can predict tomorrow. That's not the point. The point is, can you imagine tomorrow? Can you imagine all of the if-thens? Not all of them, but can you imagine a lot more than zero that could happen so you can be better prepared? There is a lot of psychology. There's a lot of neuroscience. And this is about training our minds to think the unthinkable and imagine the unthinkable. I mean, this is not just following the crowd. We're still in the middle of this pandemic. But I think everyone knows by now that going with the crowd during this pandemic time, was that the best case? Or if you were thinking about some of these worst case scenarios well in advance, would you have taken a better action than just panic? Let's jump right in. Let's talk about some of these if-thens that can always happen in our lives. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Jane McGonigal. Before I started doing this podcast, Jane, I was writing books about trading, and I'm still doing that. That's kind of my primary function. This podcast with all these interesting people like yourself became an offshoot. But in the trading books that I write about, they're very quant driven. The foundational principle is that prediction is impossible. So it's very quant driven, like reacting to price movements. And if prices move, we'll follow those moves. And if they go the other way, we'll get out. That kind of quant thinking. Now, on the flip side of that, there is the other side of my personality where I say, well, you know, I can look at certain things going on in society and you can say, well, gosh, I can look ahead a few years. I'm not going to bet money on it necessarily. That exists in all of us. Now, I think you've taken the side of, let's look at all these global macro events and whatnot that possibly could happen. And you're saying, hey, let's actually think about what could happen, which, big, long setup question. In many ways, it reminds me of almost a stoic point of view. Imagine the worst case scenario. And then when it happens, it's not as bad as if you did not imagine it to begin with.
Yes, that's exactly right. My background before I became a professional futurist was as a game designer. When I was studying the psychology of gaming and how it seemed to change people's perception of what kinds of challenges they could tackle and what kinds of problems they could solve, I saw this new mindset that I called urgent optimism. Urgent optimism, it's not like you're laid back, everything's going to be fine, I'll just let things happen. And you have a sense of urgency to act, but you feel optimistic about the ability to use your own skills and talents and strengths to adapt or survive or help others or invent something new and succeed. When I became a professional futurist, I saw that obviously people don't necessarily have that same kind of optimism about the future, whether it's dealing with climate change or migration or future technologies. We don't necessarily feel that our own individual skills and abilities are going to shape how the future turns out. So I started trying to invent a kind of gameful way to experience future challenges and threats like pandemics, which I started creating massively multiplayer future forecasting pandemic games back in 2008, 2010, to give people a chance to live through these kinds of challenges before they're real. So we can, get that kind of more urgent optimism where we get to think about what we might need to do to adapt or how we might help others, so that if the real thing actually happens, we aren't frozen with anxiety. We aren't stuck in old ways of doing things. We can act faster and adapt faster and help others more effectively. So you're absolutely right that there is a stoicism. We're facing the future with a sense of realism, that things will be challenging and we'll have to live through difficult times. Anybody who says otherwise is definitely not facing reality, but that we can use our imagination and our creativity before we get to these tough futures to set ourselves up for a little more success.
For most of 2020, I guess all of 2020, and for 11 months of 2021, I was in Saigon, Vietnam throughout the pandemic. Whether I was observing people there or observing people in America from afar, friends and family, etc., I noticed that there was a small percentage of people that were able to roll with the punches and did not seem to lose their marbles, so to speak. Listen, of course, I know if somebody is in a situation where perhaps they passed on or a family member passed on, this is quite traumatic. But when one looks at the statistics of what was going on in COVID, almost from day one, me, myself, and perhaps a few other associates of mine I was in communication with, we didn't have that sense of foreboding and all that, the world's going to end. But I saw so many people that did. What do you think it is? And maybe you'll even throw out a percentage of the people that seem to have this urgent optimism, either innate or learned. But what do you think was this dividing line? You use the pandemic as a starting point. Why some people were able to kind of like, okay, me, myself, I didn't like some of the restrictions, but I kept doing my thing. I kept my mind occupied and I didn't allow myself to like sit around and panic, get involved in social media panic porn. What do you think is the dividing line that caused some people to not have the ability to be optimistic?
I love how you framed that question, because the first thing I want to say is I have studied over the past almost 2 years how people who participated in pandemic simulations reacted to an actual pandemic. And we did see that they had more of equanimity, that they were able to experience it with less overwhelming dread and anxiety, and a stronger sense of capability and feeling like there were specific things they could do to help themselves, their families, their company, their community. Now, what you're asking is, do we think there might be something in a broader range of people who maybe have not had the opportunity to participate in a future simulation, but they might naturally have some psychological strengths that predisposition them to respond with more urgent optimism? And I would say, yes, my research suggests that there are 3 key psychological strengths that help you respond to challenges with urgent optimism. You can develop them through futures thinking, through simulations, or through your own experiences or other strategies you have for building psychological strength. The biggest one is what we call psychological flexibility, which means that you don't get stuck in assumptions. I think for someone with your background, you're constantly seeing the world in flux, the economy in flux, industries in flux. If you are able to keep that flexibility, where understanding that literally anything can change, even things that have been true for years or decades or centuries, if you have that ability to really notice change as it's starting to happen and follow that plot line and not get stuck in old ways of thinking, that's the prerequisite for urgent optimism, because then you know things can change for the worse. So you'll have to maybe adapt, but they could also change for the better. We can solve our problems and move on. That's one of the biggest things that would help drive urgent optimism. Another is what I call realistic hope, which comes from having a balance of positive and shadow imagination. People who respond to real world threats with urgent optimism they're not in denial about the bad things that can happen. They spend a fair amount of time looking at the global trends and the risks that might be on the horizon. And we actually feel more optimistic when we engage directly with those types of risks and threats. It gives you confidence that you're paying attention, don't have your head in the sand. Being able to both look at problems that might arise while paying attention to new technologies, scientific breakthroughs, new policy ideas, new kinds of business models, things that might give you hope for the future. If you have a balance of those two things, that also really helps.
So you had at least one quote I caught in your book from Alan Watts, who is a favorite of mine. As I mentioned, I was in Vietnam. Frankly, I've been in Vietnam for the last 8 years. There's an interesting thing that happens to an American who puts himself in a Buddhist country for 8 years by the process of osmosis. Even though I wasn't studying anything in particular in terms of Buddhism, you do get a little bit of that more resilient, for lack of a better term, shit can happen, be prepared, or shit can happen, don't be surprised attitude. I think there's a little bit of that in my home country where I am right now. Us Americans have probably become a little more fragile.
I actually have a fair amount of training in Zen Buddhism, participate with local monasteries, do silent retreats. There's an ancient Chinese parable that when I teach futurist thinking at Stanford University, I always start my class by telling the story. Do you know the parable of the Chinese farmer? Alan Watts wrote about it as well.
No, restate it, please.
There once was a farmer and he had a bunch of horses and one of the horses ran away. And that was really bad for his livelihood. So all of his neighbors came around and said, "Oh, we're so sorry. Your horse ran away. That's terrible, bad luck." And the farmer said, "Well, we'll see." And then the next day, the horse that had run away came home and brought with it 7 wild stallions, which was an incredible thing for him to now suddenly have these 7 powerful horses that he could work with and train. And all of his neighbors came around and said, "Oh, what good news. Congratulations. This was a great stroke of good luck." And the farmer says, "Well, we'll see." And then the next day, his son tried to train one of the wild horses and he actually fell off the horse and broke his arm and couldn't help out around the farm anymore. All the neighbors gathered around and said, "Oh, this is horrible. So sorry. This terrible bad luck has happened." The farmer says, "We'll see." And finally, the next day, a war breaks out and the army comes to conscript all of the young men, and they can't take the farmer's son because he has a broken arm and can't fight. And all of the other young men who got conscripted died in battle. All the neighbors said, "Wow, that was really good luck." And the farmer says, "We'll see." So the idea that what looks like a positive event may have unforeseen negative consequences and things that seem negative, including the pandemic potentially, that we may come out on the other side of it with people's sort of renewed sense of what matters to them, changing how they live their lives, maybe thinking differently about how we organize society. You can't say for sure when something happens, whether it's good or bad, and really it'll be both. And so we have to prepare for both the positive and the shadow outcomes of anything.
Let me give you an example, my take on the pandemic as it started, and then you can be the good professor that analyzes me and tell me where I was on the mark or crazy. I don't know if you'll be able to convince me or not, but we'll see. Here I am in January of 2020. I'm in Saigon, Vietnam. All of a sudden, we were getting a little bit of intel ahead of you guys in the States. People in Asia were getting a lot more worried, especially if you're on China's doorstep. The first videos that were coming out of China, it was like somebody's walking down the street and they just fall over like in a zombie movie dead. And you see these massive trucks rolling down the street, blowing chemicals into the air. Okay, at that moment in January 2020, I was like, well, damn, this is not looking good. We're on the doorstep. A couple months roll by and we start to get some data. And then quickly, people in America started to catch on, obviously. Dr. Fauci became the point person. Now, as I say all this, you got to keep in mind, I'm a Gen X guy. I came along in high school in the AIDS epidemic, which taught me a lesson. It taught me a lesson about government. It taught me a lesson about bureaucracy. It taught me a lesson about pandemics. And one of the lessons that I took away from that moment, especially during the AIDS time, was like, who is this affecting? Exactly. What are the odds that I can get it if I'm in a particular risk group versus someone else? So I had that thinking already built into me, and I had already seen how that had unfolded during the AIDS epidemic. There's still today certain high-risk groups for catching HIV. Finally, once we started to get into the pandemic in America, we started to realize, at least I would see doctors saying this, anecdotal or white papers, they're saying, well, gosh, the vast majority of people showing up at the hospital or the people that are dying are morbidly obese. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. So what did I do? I said, well, gosh, I'm going to lose some weight. I was already in pretty good shape, but I'm going to lose some weight. What can I control? What can I control myself? Okay, then eventually we get vaccines and we get where we are and everyone knows what's happened. But I find it quite sad that here we are in a place where we didn't know if the vaccines were going to work exactly when we rolled them out, but we could have, and we didn't, tell everyone to start losing weight. And I just saw the New York Times article the other day.
Yes, I know where you're going.
That said COVID attacks fat cells.
Fat cells, yeah.
So here I am as a Gen X guy looking at how HIV pandemic came into play. I'm looking at how the COVID pandemic came into play. I don't have a lot of trust for government right now. I really don't. Instead of being honest with all of us and saying, hey, okay, now here's the deal. If you are morbidly obese, you're in a really higher risk group. I'm guessing what happened behind the scenes is people didn't want to say that because then the people that were not in that risk group would not care. But these kinds of actions, so again, now this is all just kind of looking ahead into the future, what I would personally do or expect when the next pandemic happens. Now, how do you feel or think about when I start to raise some of the issues that I bring up? These are right in the wheelhouse of how does one attempt to look ahead to the future? How can one imagine the future?
So many interesting things to chew on what you said.
I try my best. I want to make it hard for you.
I've got at least 3 interesting things to talk now with you about. I'm going to try to remember all of them. The first is that historically, trust in government goes down after a pandemic, and it can continue to affect people's trust levels for 20 years. We don't start to see a resumption of trust in government for decades. And so that's something we see going back decades to the early 20th century. And so I think we are all going to be grappling with what forces in society do we trust to help us in any kind of a crisis. And people are going to have to rebuild trust in something, I think, whether it's local community or other kinds of mutual aid networks or governments that are helping more effectively. The idea that maybe we weren't messaging effectively about risk groups is definitely, I think people are starting to come back to that now and trying to be more nuanced about it so we can resume a more normal society. And that's important. I don't know that prior to this study that now explains why people who are overweight suffer greater severe outcomes. I don't think we knew it well enough to be quite so pointed about it, but having reviewed that literature myself, it definitely points toward a future in which globally we should be addressing our food systems and our preventative health. As somebody who thinks like a game designer, I don't expect individuals to be able to just go out and lose weight. There are structural forces in society that we could start to shift that would make it easier for people to have healthier bodies before the next pandemic, more resilient bodies. And that has to do with things like how many hours we expect people to work, because we know that when people work fewer hours or only have one job instead of 2 jobs, that they eat healthier, they exercise more flexible work where people can spend more time at home, not going into offices. So they have what used to be commute time they can use for exercise, making food cheaper. One of the scenarios I look at in my book is programs that would make fresh produce absolutely free for any citizen, that you would get a big bag that you could literally go to any farmer's market or grocery store and fill it with all the fresh fruit and vegetables you want. This is based on real programs where it turns out that it incredibly impacts people's health for the better, much more cheaply than prescription medicine or other interventions. People have fewer heart attacks, they lose weight, less strokes. There are things we can do as a society to all be stronger for the next pandemic. For someone like you who feels like you can be in control of that, that is awesome. But we should also just be thinking about changing how we live so that we're not rolling into the next pandemic. Everybody fight for yourself. You're on your own. Do what you have to. That we can already be living in a world where it's easier to be more resilient.
Can I interject? Do you think, though, my grandfather's generation, a guy who fought in World War II, do Do you think they would have said the same thing? I mean, obviously, I know why you said everything you just said. And it makes sense if people have, this gets to be the controversial part, if people are helpless, the pandemic part. Okay, I would argue that we actually knew before the New York Times stuff came out because the doctors were all saying for at least a year.
There's observation and then there's an explanation for it. We didn't have the explanation.
Who in their right mind, that the doctors are saying 80 to 90% of the people that are coming into the ERs are morbidly obese, and those are the ones that are dying, who in their right mind doesn't take that little bit of data and extrapolate? It's a life or death issue. So that's the part.
Michael, I hear you, but I think on 10-year timelines, which is part of the point of my book and the work I do, is I try to not think about, okay, what can I quick change in the next month before I get this virus? Because realistically, people were exposed to this virus before they could. How are you going to lose 100 pounds if 50% of your community is getting infected in the next month? I work on a 10-year timeline, and I encourage people to think about what we can change in 10 years. And that's why I was having people simulate pandemics literally 10 years before this pandemic, so that we would have that runway to, whether it's to make personal change or to make societal change. And for me, I am urgently optimistic that we can take collective action. It's not just pandemics, it's climate change too. An individual person really can't do very much. We have to think at scale. We have to think about geoengineering solutions. We have to seed the atmosphere to block some of the sun as an emergency action to stop the droughts and wildfires. How will we make that decision? Can any country just send seeds into the atmosphere and block the sun? China wants to do it, we let them do it. The US wants to do it, we just go for it. Or can we use this time spaciousness, this 10-year runway, to talk about what are the risks? How might it affect where I live? Do I want to move before we do this? Because I don't want to live in a flood zone when we start doing geoengineering. I mean, it's a combination of personal choices, but also thinking about collective decision-making and action. You're not going to solve climate change on your own. We do have to be thinking bigger. We have to be thinking society level, structural choices that we make.
Great point. But I also look at it and say, well, gosh, the realistic part of us is, okay, we are still a world of nation states, competitive nation states. China has their own view of how they want to do things, and the US and the West have their view. This is a great example for your work. Can you lay out some scenario? 5 years goes by like that. I don't see any scenario in the last 5 years, 10 years, 15 years where any kind of relationship with China has improved, at least in the political rhetoric land. Every time I go to China, everyone's nice to me. I've had nice experiences. But how do we get to a point at the nation state level, at a very competitive stage, for China and America to come together? I mean, here you're making the case like, hey, let's think about this 10 years into the future. Okay, I'm adapting. Where does China and America start? I can't even imagine the starting point at this point in time, is I guess where I'm headed.
Where do I look for clues about how the future might play out? And by the way, I'm not idealistic. I think, well, yeah, all we have to do is work together and everything's fine. I try to look for what are levers we could press to try to at least set ourselves up more for success. So I look around at what's happening in geoengineering now. For years, scientists who work on this technology have been basically pleading with global governing organizations to develop some kind of policy or statement on geoengineering. The only statement we have from the United Nations is that we should not do any experiments with geoengineering because it's too risky. Scientists are saying we don't have time to just ban this research. We need to have ways to collectively make decisions as a planet. For the first time, we are going to see that debated again. It's coming back as a resolution that maybe we should do more testing to see if we need to dim the sun, we can do it. And what would the consequences be? And how can we make it safer? We don't have to reinvent all of the mechanisms for making decisions globally. We should start preparing for having to think about this. To think now, if you live in a democracy, are you interested in getting some candidates running who support geoengineering? If you think that's our best hope, rather than trying to, I don't know, just bit by bit roll back our carbon emissions. Maybe we need something more dramatic. Do you know anyone who is trying to lead, who believes in that, and start surfacing people? Now, that's if you believe that that's a viable solution, which I personally do. It's super interesting. I'm just trying to get people thinking about this before someone else gives them their opinion. The easiest time to change someone's mind is before they've already made it up. Can people start doing their research now and learning more about this so that when the urgency strikes, they can have a sort of stronger sense of grounding in what they believe and what their values are?
I think the tricky thing about looking ahead is the controversial aspect, because when one is looking ahead, it often becomes political. These are often political goals, and people have different political goals. For example, if I had to look ahead to the next 10 years, and I don't think this is necessarily a political statement, what I'm going to say, but if I'm looking ahead, I'm thinking, I think the hardest thing to trust in the future is going to be the written word, because all I've seen in the last handful of years is nonstop misinformation, nonstop made up stories. And that changes your view that when you see that talking head who says come with me and I'm follow my path, and we're going to go ahead to 10 years into the future on this big plan to fix the climate crisis. Well, when that same person is also involved in other political things that are kind of tough to stomach, I think that's where the problem is we've reached a point where if we are looking ahead 10 years, I expect to not be able to trust the written word from anybody, and that I will probably have to rely on a personal philosophy and maybe other people that share that same personal philosophy, but it's going to be a land of 1984 misinformation. That's what it looks like if I had to imagine the future, versus you're being more optimistic and thinking, okay, well, we can all get together, and if there is something we can do on the climate crisis, I'm game. That's your perspective. It's a very optimistic perspective. And then I'm being a little pessimistic when I'm saying, well, hey, hold on, we're still a world of nation states. And at the diplomacy level, when China and America sits down, okay, who has to give up something to get something? So far, we haven't moved from that table at all. Those are some of my looking aheads to the future. When you hear me talk like that, how does that make you feel?
Let's talk about disinformation in a minute. It's a super important topic for the future. My optimism often comes from seeing throughout history that when science and technology works, we do tend to move forward with it as a society. Electricity, we use it. Motor vehicles, we use them. We get on airplanes. We have seen with this pandemic incredible innovations in medical technology, whether it's monoclonal antibodies, new antiviral medicines that are just coming on the market, vaccines. When things work, when we can do things that would have been unimaginable before, and they materially make new things possible, even with misinformation and propaganda and political division, you don't really see a lot of people refusing to fly or refusing to use electricity. Pretty much everyone's on the internet, whether we like it or not, whether we agree or disagree. A lot of my optimism comes from looking at technological solutions to climate change. We say at the Institute for the Future, where I'm a researcher, that in order to look ahead, you have to look back at least twice as far. There are certain consistent patterns in human history. When you say, oh, I don't know if the world will come together, or the people don't play nice, I do think if there's a technological solution to climate change, I think we will get on board in the same way that we are all on the internet. I don't know anybody who refuses all medical treatment for COVID. Even people who don't accept vaccines or vaccine mandates are still happy about monoclonal antibodies, happy about antivirals. All of that helps us move on as a planet from the pandemic. A lot of my urgent optimism comes from tracking these new technologies and seeing that scientists are advocating with political organizations, global governing organizations. And I guess I do have some faith in that. Now, when you say you won't believe the written word in the future, I mean, it's not just a written word. It's going to be audio deep fakes, visual deep fakes. AI is going to allow us to create incredibly persuasive replicas. Just from all of your podcasts, we could create a perfect Michael chatbot that I could literally just whatever I type into a word processor, you would be saying. I could make you say anything I want. Even your family and best friends would believe it was you.
Why do I think I keep doing this podcast? I mean, seriously.
Is it for immortality then?
kind of a fun side tangent, but no, considering I've done a bunch of books, I've done one documentary film, and I've done over 1,000 podcast episodes, I do know, at least compared to, let's say, a Howard Stern who's been doing it for 30 years, but I'm closing in on 10 years of doing a lot of content that will give people that have done that kind of content the ability to live on. And I would tell like family members, okay, hey, if I passed on or something in an accident, call Jane up and get the latest technology so you can recreate me. Don't tell anyone I died. Just keep me going. I mean, true, that's going to happen, isn't it? You know it's going to happen.
Oh, for sure. We're going to see authors. I was just talking with an engineer yesterday who's working on AI for writing novels. You could imagine, I don't want to say an author's name because I feel like it will be bad luck, but one of our favorite authors passes away, but they keep producing new books.
It might have already happened.
I mean, truly, right? One of the games that I have people play when I'm trying to help people get ready for anything is I have them imagine that somebody has created a replica of them. And that replica is being used to say things that they disagree with. It could be political, it could be religious, it could be social, whatever. And that person's like broadcasting online and all these people are watching. How do you react in that moment that somebody has made a replica of you using whatever audio you've uploaded, whatever video you've uploaded, all of your messages? It can learn your writing styles and patterns. How would you react in the first 5 minutes of that? I love to ask people, what would you do in the first 5 minutes? Because it allows you to just go into that almost like survival mode. Okay, how do I respond? How do I feel? Who do I contact first? And if you have no idea what you would do, then that's like an indication that you should find out a little bit more about this risk or this threat or this technology so that if it rolls around and you're experiencing it, you're not flying blind.
I've got an answer for you.
Oh, tell me. Yeah. What do you do?
The answer is I've seen this on Instagram and I've seen it with several other authors that I know, some that have sold a lot more books than me, and they've got an even bigger problem. One author told me at any given time on Twitter and Instagram, he's got 30 different bots pretending to be him. I've got at least one on Instagram that's pretending to be me. This bot emails people out some offer that I'm supposedly doing and this and that. Now, so, okay, I thought, whatever they call themselves this day, maybe it's Meta, I thought Mr. Meta would have a solution for this. If you see a fake account, you can report it. Well, you can't. I've already learned that, okay, if somebody did do what you just described, they took all of my content and they made a bot mic. If their servers are outside of the purview of wherever, there's not going to be anything we can do unless the Google guys are going to give some blocking options, whatever the one act we can use sometimes to block things. But there could possibly be, here's me using my imagination. What if we get to a future where there's no blocking of these bots and no one knows? There's 15 Janes out there. Do I roll the dice that particular day to think if I'm getting the right Jane? I mean, how do you know?
I mean, I think it is likely we will get to a moment like that. I'm very interested. I'm seeing a lot of people who work in the field of copyright law looking at the possibility of essentially that it would be illegal to base algorithms on someone else's creative content without their consent. So in the same way that I can't publish one of your books, I can't like take content from your books and just do whatever I want with it. You own that it would be illegal to make algorithms based on someone else's content. Now, that wouldn't stop malicious actors from doing it, but it might prevent a total media apocalypse where we're living in a constant stream of just total unknowing who is the authentic voice or writer or actor. But again, I base my ideas about what might happen in the future on whatever signals of change I'm seeing on the ground. What is the legal profession gearing up for? What are the battles they're getting ready to fight? Is another just really useful place to look for clues about the future.
How do you pick the issues that you decided to exemplify in your work? For example, some of the ones that I jotted down, which I think could be viewed as being controversial for some people, throwing out some phrases, racial justice, a livable salary, perhaps limited free speech, talking about a broken health system versus perhaps a broken individual system of people just eating too much. You also talk about economic inequality. How did you decide that these particular issues, which are super hot button issues, how did you decide these particular issues were ones you wanted to use as examples?
At the Institute for the Future, we have been doing research on what we're describing as pre-existing conditions that make any systemic shock harder to survive or recover from. And that could be an economic collapse, it could be a pandemic, it could be an asteroid, it could be any catastrophic shock to the system. And these are the existing conditions that just make it harder for us to be resilient and have quick adaptations or positive outcomes for all. This is what the research suggests, whether it's the climate crisis or racial inequities or worker systems that are essentially in many countries and industries exploitative. People are so burnt out, they don't have the mental and physical resilience, let alone the economic security to survive shocks to their system. That's why they appear in the book. I also just spend a lot of time talking to people whose job it is to scan the horizon for threats. One of my favorite tools is the World Economic Forum has an annual global threats, global risks report, where they survey CEOs, scientists, people who work in emergency response in governments. They survey really top thinkers about what they're most worried about, what's keeping you up at night. And I work from that list as well to kind of look ahead. I'll tell you, we can't say for sure these risks will happen, but if I know that many people consider this the scariest thing that keeps them up at night, that's something I want to look at and be prepared for. Well, one of the risks that came out this year that hadn't been on the list before was essentially youth disengagement. What happens if people under 25 stop believing in that the government will take action or that society will protect them? What if they go on a global work strike? What if they refuse to play along with systems as they are today? Are we prepared for that? There was a landmark study of more than 10,000 young people that was just published a couple months ago. 10,000 young people globally aged 16 to 25. 56% said humanity is doomed and that they personally have no future. What is that generation going to do if they truly believe that? I think that's an underrepresented risk or threat in our culture now. Really taking seriously, if people believe there is no future, how will they act? That's where terrorism comes from, that total alienation and absence of hope. But it could also be a positive force if this generation decides to really force our hand to change things that have been too slow to change.
I didn't see you write about it in particular, but I think for myself, if I had to look ahead to the next 10 years, I don't think this is any kind of minority view. I think it's probably a pretty strong view amongst a certain number of people across the world. The number one fear would be government overreach, this 1984 overreach, the V for Vendetta government overreach. I mean, look, I was in Southeast Asia watching newscasts during the day and seeing how a country that was known for Crocodile Dundee, good times, and, have a beer, all of a sudden you're seeing visual images from Australia that were like, wow, that's not good for tourism. It's not good for tourism to have what was going on, night sticking people over COVID, dragging people off to physical camps over COVID that damn sure look like concentration camps. That's the part where people start to say, well, gosh, maybe these young people that don't have the optimism, maybe it's also because they don't trust that all of the folks that are in the government, they look like they're all getting rich in the government. Everyone in government these days is getting rich, super rich. Looks like a great job.
Some of the things you're saying do make me uncomfortable. And I do want to just state for the record that I do not believe that most of the global response to the pandemic has been overreach. And you and I definitely disagree on that. I don't personally participate in that worldview at all. Just to be totally clear on the data, the number one cause for feeling anxious and afraid about the future is the government's failure to act urgently to address climate change specifically. That is, without a doubt, the number one cause for that dread and fear for the future. And in reality of this landmark study, what they want is more urgent and collective global action. You may disagree that that is required or necessary, but just in terms of what young people are feeling, what they are feeling is that there isn't enough government action. The thing about futures imagination is you can see that as a threat or an opportunity. If you're somebody who wants more global action or more coordinated global effort, then that's an opportunity and you can leverage that. And if you think that the pandemic response has been overreach and you don't want the same kind of overreach in response to climate change, at least address this. Don't be in denial that this is how the next generation feels. It's going to be a force to reckon with, whether you like it or not. We try to acknowledge the reality of what's happening, and then you can decide, do I want to leverage that or not?
I would love for you to address, you said, okay, you're not going to participate in something. I'm not really sure what, and I don't think my audience would be sure either, what you did not like of what I just said, because I was trying to be damn factually accurate.
Yeah, concentration camp is not a word that I would use in response to what I have seen globally with the pandemic. I think that's pretty offensive.
I didn't say globally. I said Australia.
Yeah, I'm just saying, you asked what I found. I would strongly dispute that.
There are camps in Australia where you are not charged and you are taken if you have COVID and you're not allowed out. If that imagery exists, people are going to develop views about the future. That was my point. I'll give a simple example, a really simple example where trust gets broken. If you're looking ahead into the future where there are a certain number of people around this world that have lost faith in government. So my family lives in the Washington, D.C. area. I saw a game where Dr. Fauci went out to the Washington Nationals game and he threw out the first pitch. And he threw out the first pitch wearing the mask. A few innings later, he's in the stands not wearing the mask. You can see this across politicians. You can see this across celebrities.
For a conversation about the future, this is feeling pretty stuck in the past to me right now. Truly, you have a great pugilistic style as a conversationalist, but I don't want to debate the politics of COVID. I think we could talk about some other things.
What I'm trying to paint a picture is there's all different ways to look at the future, and people are taking in all kinds of inputs. So when I read your work, I see you're taking in inputs. I'm pointing out there are other people taking in perfectly valid inputs from inconsistencies and hypocrisies. And if people take in the inconsistencies, they take in the hypocrisies, and they look ahead to the future, they say, well, gosh, this is what you want us to do. You want us to imagine the future, but not everyone's going to imagine it the same way you imagine it.
Right. And that's why when I run a simulation, we'll have 20,000 people participate from all over the world, all different ages, genders, economic backgrounds, educational backgrounds, because we want to see the future from many different points of view. That's sort of my specialty. In classical simulations, war games, you would invite 10 or 20 experts, maybe at most 100 experts to try to game out different future scenarios. What I do that is unlike any of that traditional process is open it up to anyone who wants to explore the possibility and state their point of view. We ask people, what would you do in this future? What would you need? What would you worry about? What would you be excited about? What advantage would you try to gain? What loophole would you try to exploit? I absolutely share your assessment that people come to the future with different values, different goals, different needs. I'm pretty proud to be the first person to ever create massively public simulations of the kinds of future scenarios that were usually done behind closed doors in the government or in rooms of power. I agree with you on that point. And we don't have to agree about the future. We also don't have to fight about it. I don't really try to change people's minds about the future. I just try to plant seeds. I would hope that after today, people listening to this podcast, now they've got their radar up for a few different things, for geoengineering, for deep fakes, whatever they might do with that. It's not something I can or want to control. So we don't have to get into a debate about the politics of everything. I just want people to plant more possibilities in their mind. And I think if more of us are giving ourselves more time to think about it, whatever people's opinions are, we're going to do better because at least we won't be shocked, if that makes sense.
Do you think people are wrong, though, to take data points from their perspective and draw? I said this at the beginning. There's definitely some controversial aspects to some of the ways that you've outlined things, and I'm pushing back on some of those. But do you think it's wrong for people to take data points from their experience and look ahead to the future? Because now you push back on me, you say, hey, I don't want to go to a certain place because I said concentration camp. Okay, I get it. I could have just said camp. Okay, I don't know. Maybe you would have pushed back on me if I said just camp. But people are going to take data points from their experience and they're going to look ahead to the future. I tried to post something on Facebook just the other day, and it was talking about risk management and why do we, when we get on a big, wide airplane, why do we still put our seatbelts on? Because the risks are so dramatically low. And the point of the article was this overreach, which I see growing and growing into the future. This overreach by government has been around long before COVID. Facebook was saying, okay, here's a disclaimer to talk about COVID when the article wasn't even really about COVID. Me as a guy who's just in the middle of having these debates and conversations, what conclusion can I draw? I'm not drawing a conclusion that says, well, gosh, I'm looking ahead 10 years and seeing a happy-go-lucky government that's on my side and taking care of me. I'm looking at something where I'm saying, man, trust here is going to be hard to come by.
Facebook is a fascinating example because Facebook is not a government body. However, in a sense, they are the largest nation state on earth with more than 1 billion citizens, taking over a lot of the functions that we might have previously ceded to governments in the past. They have their own cryptocurrency unit. They're trying to have a force in the banking world and money systems. What I would do as a futurist in response to your experience is not to get into the weeds of this particular post or what's happening today, but really to zoom out. I mean, if we feel that free speech, which is a right that is granted to us from the government, can be threatened by a non-government actor like Facebook, what that tells us is that our technology companies are taking over, in many ways, roles that we used to previously assign to political systems or governing systems. To me, that's more interesting. Yeah.
100%. And what's even more nasty about it is that Facebook has certain exemptions under certain acts that give them certain protections. You're right. To me, we've always known growing up what free speech was in America, at least. You can't go screaming fire in a crowded theater. But today you can clearly see, if I'm looking ahead 10 years from now, whether it's only Facebook or whether it becomes government actors inside the US government, there's definitely a push to change what the definitions of free speech have long been. That's perfectly obvious to me. Now, would you say what's perfectly obvious to me is crazy to you? I could see it all day long that we're going down a limited speech path.
So this is a value that's really important to many people, yourself included. And what I encourage people to do is when you have these experiences today that really bring into focus something that makes you angry, it's connected to a deeply held value that you have, is that you can bring this to any new technology or media space and look for a way to protect or preserve that value. So I'm really interested in drones, for example. Drones is an emerging technology. And there's a lot of tension developing between our drones surveillance. Are they authoritarian technology used by government to watch or police to do remote policing? Or are they about essentially it's equivalent to freedom of speech, that freedom of visual access to be able to record from the skies using a camera and to share that media to reveal what's really happening? Well, we're seeing drone constellations where people are making messages in the skies and they're doing art installations in the skies. And at the same time, people are creating no drone zones where you're not allowed to fly drones. And to me, all of what you're experiencing on Facebook, like, okay, Facebook is very 2020, but looking ahead to 2030, are we going to police the skies?
Legitimate questions. I'll give you an example that just happened to me also over the weekend. I was at my nephew's high school football game, the state championship for the state of Virginia at a Old Dominion University campus in Norfolk, Virginia. Most of the people that are letting us into the stadium, probably in their 20s, maybe even a little younger, people kind of manning the gates, so to speak. And maybe there was 10,000 people there. It wasn't that big of a crowd for a high school state championship game. But we knew in advance, because my busybody sister had let us all know, we knew in advance that we had to use only clear plastic bags to put any personal items we had to bring in. If my father wanted to carry a bag in, he couldn't carry that small bag with his credit cards. He had to use this clear plastic bag. And I thought to myself, I guess in advance of this conversation a little, this is kind of going back in time. How many people in that stadium that day actually thought to themselves, my gosh, this is a direct connection to bin Laden?
I have no idea. Do you have an idea?
I was probably the only one that was thinking that. Maybe there were some security people in Norfolk that were kind of reminiscing about it. But I mean, the idea that you couldn't go to a state championship high school football game without having all of your materials in a clear plastic bag is directly related to everything that sprung from 9/11. This really gets into, if you were to go back and model, and you could because you've got the technology, if you were to go back and model after 9/11, okay, now we see where the TSA is going to go. How far will the TSA go over the next 20 years? Well, we went all the way to the point that at a high school football game, you could only take clear plastic bags in. Now, that would be a great example of the future modeling coming from your work, wouldn't it?
If you had asked people in 2001, if 20 years later, we would be still doing these heightened security measures, I mean, I think people would be surprised by that. And so I think you're right.
Would your modeling be surprised, though? That's my real question. Would the unobjective, unemotional modeling be surprised necessarily? Because, once this stuff is created, it becomes jobs, it becomes bureaucracy. People are manning those positions. Would the modeling have been surprised? Forget us individual people with opinions.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. You said objective. My modeling is actually quite emotional. I mean, one of the things that really factors into the future forecasts I make.
You did get mad at me for saying concentration camp. I'm assuming that's going to be a keyword somewhere in the next model. Okay, get that Covel concentration camp thing in there. This guy's bad news.
I'm asking people what they would be excited about and what they would be worried about. I ask people about their needs. I'm not running mathematical calculations. I'm trying to surface surprising human reactions. I did not model security in 2001. That's when I was still studying game psychology. When we ran our early pandemic simulations, we asked people to try wearing masks in everyday social situations. One of these pandemic simulations, it was 6 weeks long, and we had people just look around their everyday lives and what would you do differently? What would be hard? What would you resist? What would you refuse to do if they told you you couldn't go to church? Would you go anyway? Would you create underground churches? What would you protest? What kind of job would you quit? That's not a rational mathematical model. What I was trying to surface in all of my simulations, we're trying to figure out what's going to happen that the rational forecasts don't predict. And we knew people were going to resist mask wearing. We saw very early on how difficult it would be to make that feel comfortable or normal.
But that's flips now, isn't it? If you had to look ahead 10 years into the future, look, I've been in Asia in the last 8 years. And if anyone's been through a place like Tokyo and even into Vietnam, China, people wear masks regularly already for all kinds of reasons. If you're personally sick, it's nice manners to wear a mask in Asia. But I can imagine now, if I had to look ahead 10 years into the future, if I walked into a Whole Foods in America, can I imagine walking in and seeing a certain percentage with masks on that I never would have seen 10 years ago? I'm sure I could.
For sure. And think about the emergence of facial recognition technology. I mean, people may be masking in ways that we're not even ready for.
Thank you for reminding me of that. It's my version of the V for Vendetta mask.
Talk about unexpected consequences. So during the pandemic, a lot of the companies that do facial recognition, they had to adapt to mask wearing. And the technology has gotten so much better because of the pandemic, because now these same algorithms can detect you just based on your eyes. They don't need your whole face anymore. That's an unexpected consequence. When I try to imagine myself in the future, sometimes I imagine myself where everybody's wearing dark sunglasses in public. That's what we do, in the same way you wouldn't write your credit card number on your front door for anybody to see, that we have to take security precautions like that.
We have agreement here. We both agree that in the future, dark sunglasses and masks to protect our privacy.
I think that is going to be a choice that we make as society. And either we're going to ban the technology so that we can still see each other's faces, or we're going to see many people refusing to participate in face-to-face human interaction in the same way. It could go either way.
That might be the most important issue. Seriously, we really had to look ahead in the future. That basic element of privacy, and you bring it up with the drones, that could be the most important issue that we've talked about today. What's coming down the pike?
Great. I agree. I guess what I really want people to take away from my book and from this conversation is that we still have a choice. These things are not decided yet. We have ways to exert influence on the future, whether it's in the conversations we have on podcasts or the art that we make or the stories we tell or the people we vote for or decisions we make for our kids. We can still affect whether we wind up in a future where facial recognition technology is limited or banned or we don't show our faces anymore. Let's try to influence that rather than just ceding it to some people in government or some people in technology. That would be my hope.
I think it's a wonderful hope. There's a side of me, though, that if I have to imagine the future, I can imagine your hope coming nowhere close to happening.
Let's not seed the future without a fight, I guess is what I'm saying. Let's not leave it in the hands of a few.
America's up for a fight right now, isn't it? I kind of get that feeling, right?
Oh, yeah. I believe you are correct.
So we need to have a future podcast. We take the gloves off after the book comes out. Just really get in the ring. You're like, Michael, I want no part of that. Jane, great conversation. The book, Imaginable, How to See the Future Coming and Feel Ready for Anything, even things that seem impossible today. It's a great way to think. I don't think a lot of people really sit down and ever do that, really. Maybe just a little bit, but not 10 years ahead. Most people don't.
Yeah. And this is great. You have challenged me in really interesting ways today, Michael. So thank you for diving in and taking these ideas seriously enough to challenge them and talk with me about them. I appreciate it.
Everyone else can do softball stuff. It won't be as fun. You'll text me. You're like, yours is more fun.
That's what you're known for. That's what you do.
Where can we send people? Where would you like to go?
I'm setting up a community for people who read the book and want to actually roll up their sleeves and try to control how the future turns out at urgentoptimist.org. We can play these future simulations together and we can strategize about the future we want to make.
Let me just double check that. urgentoptimist.org?
Plural, because we're going to hang out together. Urgent Optimists.
Jane, very cool stuff. I appreciate you coming on today.
This is awesome. Thank you for having me.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.